If you grew up watching Saturday matinees, you know the image well. The sheriff stands tall in the middle of a dusty street, a tin star pinned to his chest, waiting for the outlaw to draw first. He is the barrier between civilization and chaos. He is a man of honor. He fights fair. That image is a lie. The reality of law enforcement in the American West between 1865 and 1890 was not a story of good versus evil. It was a story of survival. The men who wore the badge were often indistinguishable from the men they hunted. In fact, many of them were the same men. History records show us that a significant number of the most famous lawmen, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, were professional gamblers, saloon owners, and sometimes fugitives themselves. They didn't enforce the law because of a moral calling. They did it because the badge gave them a monopoly on violence. In towns like Dodge City, Deadwood, and Tombstone, the difference between a sheriff and a killer was often just a piece of paper signed by a desperate town council. They didn't shoot to wound. They didn't shoot to disarm. And they certainly didn't wait for the other man to draw. They shot to kill, often from behind, often with a shotgun, and almost always without a warning. The Hollywood myth tells us they were protectors. The archives tell us they were town tamers, mercenaries hired to crush resistance with brutal efficiency. Today, we are going to look at the blood-soaked reality of the Old West lawman, and why, in the eyes of history, the star on the chest was often just a target for the next man with a gun. To understand why these men were so deadly, we must first strip away the romance of the frontier. After the Civil War, the West was a vast, ungoverned vacuum. The federal government had little reach. There was no FBI, no highway patrol, no radio backup. If you were a town councilman in a cattle town like Abilene, Kansas in 1870, you had a problem. Thousands of young, armed, and often drunk cowboys were coming up the Chisholm Trail. They had money to spend and anger to burn. They didn't respect the law. They respected force. You couldn't hire a polite constable to handle Texas drovers. You needed a killer. This created a specific economic niche, the town tamer. These were men known for their proficiency with a revolver. Towns competed for them like sports teams compete for athletes today. The pay was deceptively low, often a base salary of $75 to $150 a month. But the real money wasn't in the salary, it was in the fees. Sheriffs and marshals received a cut of every arrest fee, every fine levied, and often the bounties on heads. This system encouraged aggression. It didn't pay to de-escalate a situation. It paid to make an arrest, or better yet, to kill a wanted man and collect the reward without the hassle of a trial. Furthermore, the jurisdiction was messy. You had city marshals, county sheriffs, and U.S. marshals, often stepping on each other's toes. In many cases, these lawmen were also running the local gambling halls or brothels. The badge was a business tool. It allowed them to disarm their competition while keeping their own weapons. When Wyatt Earp was in Tombstone, he wasn't just a lawman. He was a faro dealer protecting his investments. The violence wasn't about justice, it was about market control. We tend to think of these men as steely-eyed sharpshooters who never made mistakes. The records show a different picture. They were human, often alcoholic, and prone to fatal errors driven by adrenaline and fear. Take the case of James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok. In 1871, he was the Marshal of Abilene. He was effectively a hired gun for the town. On the night of October 5th, a brawl broke out. Hickok confronted a gambler named Phil Coe. Shots were exchanged. Hickok was fast, deadly fast. He put 2 bullets into Coe's stomach. But what happened next reveals the chaos of 19th century policing. In the smoke and darkness, another figure came, running toward Hickok. It was Mike Williams, Hickok's own special deputy, coming to assist him. Nerves frayed, reacting on pure instinct and paranoia, Hickok spun around and fired 2 shots into the running man. He killed his own deputy instantly. This wasn't a heroic standoff. It was a tragedy born of a trigger-happy mindset. Hickok, the Prince of Pistoliers, wept over the body of the man he killed. He never fought a gun battle again after that night. He was fired by the town shortly after. The people of Abilene realized that having a celebrity killer as a sheriff brought more blood to the streets, not less. This was a common theme. Lawmen often escalated minor disputes into lethal encounters because they lacked the temperament for peace. They were hammers, and every problem looked like a nail. They drank on duty, they held grudges, and they used their authority to settle personal scores. The line between maintaining order and committing murder was crossed so frequently that citizens often feared the badge as much as the bandit. History books in schools often skip over the regulators. This is the uncomfortable truth about the West. Law enforcement was often privatized. Wealthy cattle barons and mining conglomerates didn't trust local sheriffs, who might be sympathetic to small farmers or workers. So, they hired their own law, men like Frank Canton. In the history of the Wyoming Range Wars, Canton is listed as a sheriff and a U.S. deputy marshal, but in reality, he was a hitman for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. During the Johnson County War, Canton and a group of regulators, all deputized, all wearing badges, invaded a county to assassinate small ranchers they accused of rustling. This wasn't law enforcement. It was a death squad with legal cover. They carried a dead list of men to be executed. This aspect of the West destroys the myth of the impartial lawman. The badge was often bought and paid for by corporate interests. The law was weaponized against the poor. If you were a homesteader on the wrong side of a cattle fence, the sheriff wasn't coming to save you. He was likely coming to burn your barn, and he had the legal authority to do it. We also rarely discuss the shotgun policy. In movies, you see quick-draw duels. In reality, smart lawmen like Morgan Earp or Doc Holliday, who was often deputized, preferred a 10-gauge shotgun. They didn't want a fair fight. During the assassination of Tom McClory in the OK Corral fight, he was nearly cut in half by a shotgun blast. It was brutal, messy, and devastating. It wasn't sport. It was extermination. What was the price of living by the gun? Hollywood shows the hero riding off into the sunset. The archives show a path to poverty, alcoholism, and violent death. Being a deadly sheriff was a young man's game. If you survived the job, you were often left with nothing. There were no pensions for Old West lawmen, no retirement homes. Look at Pat Garrett. He is famous for killing Billy the Kid. For a moment, he was a hero, but the fame turned sour. The public began to view him as a backstabber who killed a young man in the dark. Garrett spent the rest of his life trying to capitalize on that one killing, failing at business after business, drinking heavily, and becoming increasingly bitter. In 1908, Garrett wasn't gunned down in a blaze of glory. He was shot in the back of the head while urinating by the side of the road during a dispute over a goat lease. He died broke and his killer was acquitted. The man who killed the most famous outlaw in history died like a dog in the dirt. Or take the psychological toll. Many of these men suffered from what we would now call PTSD. They were paranoid. They sat with their backs to the wall. They slept with weapons. They couldn't integrate into the civilized society they helped create. As the 20th century approached, the gunfighter sheriff became an embarrassment. Towns wanted paved roads and telephones, not old men with notches on their guns. They were discarded. The consequence of their violence was that they eventually became obsolete. The civilization they fought for had no place for them. We must be careful when we look back at the American West. It is easy to judge these men by the standards of today, but they lived in a time when the nearest judge was 3 days' ride away, and the nearest doctor was usually the local barber. However, we must also stop worshiping a fantasy. The Old West. Sheriff was not a knight in shining armor. He was a pragmatic, often ruthless operator in a violent marketplace. He was deadly because he had to be, and often because he enjoyed it. The sheriff and the outlaw were two sides of the same coin. Both were men of action. Both rejected the quiet life, and both were willing to kill to survive. The only difference was that one had society's permission. When you see that tin star in a museum, don't think of justice. Think of survival. The West wasn't tamed by the law book. It was tamed by men who were willing to be just as savage as the wilderness surrounding them. And that is the hard truth that Hollywood will never fully admit.